Chapter 3 of Fairylands of the South Seas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti. Chapter 3. Marooned on Mataora. The sun was low when the Fayette steamed out through the pass and headed for the Cook Group, 600 miles west and south. Dark clouds hung over Raiatea, Regi Atea of Maori tradition, the land of the bright heavens. But the level sunlight still illuminated the hillsides of Tahaa, the lovely sister island, protected by the same great oval reef. Far off to the north, the peak of Bora Bora towered abruptly from the sea. It was not yet the season of the trades, and the northeast breeze which followed us brought a sweltering heat, intolerable anywhere but on deck. Worthington was sitting beside me, a lean man, darkly tanned, with very bright blue eyes. His feet were bare. He wore a singlet, trousers of white drill, and a Manihiki hat, beautifully played of bleached pandanus sleeve, a hat not to be bought with money. The dinner gong sounded. "I'm not going down," he remarked. "Too hot below. I had something to eat in Mataora. How about you?" I shook my head. It needed more than a normal appetite to drive me to the dining salon. Banks of squall cloud, shading from gray to an unwholesome violet, were gathering along the horizon, and the air was so heavy that one inhaled it with an effort. "This is the worst month of the hurricane season," Worthington went on. "It was just such an evening as this last year that the waterspout nearly got us the night we sighted Mataora. I was 5 months up there, you know, marooned, when Johnson lost the old Hatutu. I was pretty well done up last year. When I heard that the Hatutu was in Abura, I decided to take a vacation and go for a 6 weeks' cruise with Johnson. Ordinarily he would have laid up in Papeete until after the equinox, but the company had sent for him to make a special trip to Marooned. He had a wretched passage north, a succession of squalls and broiling calms. The schooner was in bad shape, anyway, rotten sails, rigging falling to pieces, and 6 inches of grass on her bottom. On a hot day she had a bouquet all her own. The sun distilled from her a blend of cockroaches and mildewed copra that didn't smell like a rose garden. On the 13th day the skipper told me we were 200 miles from Penryn, and so close to Mataora that we might sight the palm tops. I'd heard a lot about the place. It has an English name on the chart. How isolated it was, what a pleasant crowd the natives were, and how it was the best place in the Pacific to see old-fashioned island life. We had been working to windward against a light northerly breeze, but the wind began to drop at noon, and by 3 o'clock it was glassy calm. There was a wicked-looking mass of clouds moving toward us from the west, but the glass was high, and Johnson said we were in for nothing worse than a squall. As the clouds drew near, I could see that they had a sort of purplish black heart, broad at the top, pointed at the bottom, and dropping gradually toward the water. There was something queer about it. The mate was pointing, and Johnson's Kanakas were all standing up. Suddenly I heard a rushing sound like a heavy squall passing through the bush. The point of the funnel had touched the sea 300 or 400 yards away from us, a water spout. There wasn't a breath of air, and the Hatutu had no engine. It was moving straight for us, so slowly that I could watch every detail of its formation. The boys slid our boat overboard. The mate sang out something about all hands being ready to leave the schooner. I've heard of waterspouts ever since I was a youngster, but I never expected to see one as close as we did that day. As the point of cloud dropped toward the sea, it was ragged and ill-defined, but when it touched the water and the noise began, I saw its shape change and its outlines grow hard. It was now a thin column 4 or 5 feet in diameter, raising a couple of 100 feet before it swelled in the form of a flat cone to join the clouds above. Curiously enough, it was not perpendicular, but had a decided sagging curve. Nearer and nearer it came, until I could make out the great swirling hole at its base, and see the vitreous look of this column of solid water revolving at amazing speed. It hadn't the misty edges of a waterfall. The outside was sharply defined as the walls of a tumbler. I wondered what would happen when it struck the Hatutu. The mate was shouting again, but just then the skipper pushed a rifle into my hands. "Damned if I leave the old hooker," he swore. "Shoot into the thing. Maybe we can break it up." And believe me or not, we did break it up. It didn't come down with a crash, as one might have expected. When we had pumped about 20 shots into it, it was not more than 50 yards away. It began to dwindle. The column of water became smaller and drew itself out to nothing. The rushing noise ceased. The hole in the sea disappeared in a lazy eddy. The dark funnel rose and blended with the clouds above. A fine southeast breeze sprang up as the clouds disappeared, and we were reaching away for Marooned, when a boy up forward gave a shout and pointed to the northwest. Sure enough, there was a faint line on the horizon, the palms of Mataora. A sudden idea came to me. I was fed up with the schooner. Why not ask to be put ashore and picked up on the Hatutu's return from Faery? She would be back in a fortnight, and it was only a few miles out of her way to drop me and pick me up. Johnson is a good fellow. His answer to my proposition was to change his course at once and slack away for the land 12 miles to leeward. "You'll have a great time," he said. "I wish I were going with you. Old Terry will put you up. I'll give you a word to him. Take along 2 or 3 bags of flour and a few presents for the women." At 5 o'clock we were off the principal village, with canoes all about us and more coming out through the surf. The men were a fine, brawny lot, joking with the crew and eager for news and small trade. I lowered my box, some flour, tobacco, and a few bolts of calico into the largest canoe and said good-bye to Johnson. It was nearly a year before I saw him again. As you know, he lost a Hatutu on Flying Venus Shoal. They made Penryn in the boat and got a passage to Tahiti 2 months later. Everyone knew I was on Mataora, but it was 5 months before a schooner could come and take me off. There is no pass into the lagoon. As we drew near the shore, I saw that the easy, deceptive swell reared up to form an ugly surf ahead of us. At one point, where a crowd of people was gathered, there was a large, irregular fissure in the coral, broad and deep enough to admit the passage of a small boat, and filled with rushing water each time a breaker crashed on the reef. My 2 paddlers stopped opposite this fissure, and just outside the surf, watching over their shoulders for the right wave. They let 4 or 5 good-sized ones pass, backing water gently with their paddles. But at last a proper one came, rearing and tossing its crest till I thought it would break before it reached us. My men dug their paddles into the water, shouting exultantly as they darted forward. The shouts were echoed on shore. By Jove, it was a thriller! Tilting just on the break of the wave, we flew in between jagged walls of coral up the fissure, around a turn, and before the water began to rush back, a dozen men and women had plunged in waist-deep to seize the canoe. Mataora is made up of a chain of low islands, all densely covered with coconut palms, strung together in rough oval to enclose a lagoon 5 miles by 3. Though there is no pass, the surf at high tide breaches over the gaps between the islands. The largest island is only 1.5 miles long, and none of them are more than half a mile across. Dotted about the surface of the lagoon are a number of matu, tiny islets, each with its flock of seafowl, its clump of palms, and shining beach of coral sand. Set in a lonely stretch of the Pacific, the place is almost cut off from communication with the outside world. Twice or 3 times in the course of a year a trading schooner calls to leave supplies and take off copra. Undisturbed by contact with civilization, the life at Mataora flows on, simple, placid, and agreeably monotonous. Very little changed, I fancy, since the old days. It is true that they have a native missionary and use calico, flour, and tobacco when they can get them, but these are minor things. The great events in their annals are the outrage of the Peruvian slavers in 1862, when many of the people were carried off to labor and die in the Chinchas Island, and the hurricane of 1913. After presenting myself to the missionary and the chief, I was escorted by a crowd of youngsters to the lagoon side of the island, where Terry lived, in a spot cooled by the trade wind and pleasantly shaded by coconuts. The old chap was a warm friend of Johnson's and made me welcome. I soon arranged to put up with him